Dust hung thick as judgment in the blistering heat of Dust Creek's auction yard. Ilera Vance, her belly heavy with the child of her dead husband, felt the crowd stares like physical blows. On the crude platform stood the broken remnants of a man. Caleb Holt, bloodied bandage stark against his temple, and his two wide-eyed children huddled close. When the leering rancher Silas Rourke bid, picturing cheap labor and broken spirits, Ilera's grief crystallized into defiance. Her voice, raw but unwavering, sliced of the murmurs. $20. It wasn't charity. It was a shield raised against the desert's cruelty, bought with the last coins from Silas's buried tin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The sun beat down on Dust Creek like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. It bleached the false front of the meager buildings lining the single street, baked the dirt to a fine, choking powder that coated everything: boots, skirts. The weary mules tethered outside the saloon in the faces of the gathered crowd. Ilera Vance stood at the edge of this throng, near the weather trough outside the livery, the rough-hewn wood digging into the small of her back. A hand rested instinctively on the swell beneath her faded calico dress, a constant, heavy reminder. Silas, her Silas, buried 3 months back beneath a cairn of stones up on the mesa after a rockfall in the mine he'd sunk their meager savings into. Hope felt like a foreign coin, heavy and useless in this parched land. The auction block was simply a raised section of planking outside the town marshal's office. The usual detritus of frontier hardship passed under the auctioneer's gavel: a worn saddle, a crate of dented tins, a scrawny milk cow. Then came the human lot. Indenture auctions weren't uncommon, desperate measures for desperate times, but this one drew a thicker silence, laced with morbid curiosity. Marshal Briggs, doubling as auctioneer, cleared his throat, his voice raspy. Next lot, Caleb Holt, indenture to cover debts incurred, includes labor capacity diminished as it is presently. He gestured with a jerk of his chin. 2 men hauled Caleb Holt onto the planks. He was tall, or had been, but now he stooped, one arm clamped protectively around 2 small children pressed against his legs. A crude bandage, stained rusty brown, covered the left side of his head and temple, disappearing into matted, dark hair. His shirt was torn and filthy, one sleeve hanging loose where the arm beneath seemed unnaturally still. His face, beneath grime and bruising, was gaunt, etched with pain and a profound weariness that went beyond the physical. Yet his eyes, a startlingly clear gray against the pallor, held a fierce, protective light as they scanned the crowd, lingering for a fraction longer on the children clinging to him. A boy of about 7, face set in a stoic mask, but eyes darting like a trapped rabbit, and a girl, perhaps 5, clutching a grubby, headless corn husk doll. Debt's ode to Silas Rourke, duly recorded. Briggs added, his tone flat. A stir ran through the crowd. Rourke, a rancher whose holdings sprawled north of town, leaned against a post near the front. Thumbs hooked his belt, a smirk playing on his lips beneath a thick, tobacco-stained mustache. He wore his prosperity like armor, a clean duster, a silver concho on his hatband. His gaze swept over Caleb Holt with a detached appraisal of a man inspecting a lame horse. Terms: 5 years indenture for the man. Briggs continued. Children bound with him. Wards until maturity or settlement. Opening bid, $10. Rourke pushed off the post. $10, he drawled, the sound oily in the dry air. Reckon I can find some use for him. Kids can earn their keep sweeping stables. His chuckle was a low rumble, devoid of humor. The little girl whimpered, burying her face in her father's leg. Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dust at his boots. Shame radiated from him like heat shimmer. Ilera's breath hitched. She saw the way the boy, Ben, flinched at Rourke's voice. She saw the utter exhaustion in Caleb Holt's posture, the tremor in his uninjured arm where he held his daughter, Lily. She saw the ghost of her own future, vulnerability, isolation, the terrifying weight of raising a child alone in this unforgiving place. The memory of Silas's laughter, his strong hands building their small ranch house, flashed bright and painful. Then the image shifted. Her child, born into a world as harsh as this auction yard. A fierce, unexpected surge rose in her chest, hotter than the desert sun. It wasn't just pity, it was rebellion. Rebellion against the loneliness gnawing at her, against the cruelty embodied by Rourke's smirk, against the sheer, crushing unfairness of it all. 15! A voice called from the back. Old man Henderson, maybe needing a hand at his smithy, his bid tinged with reluctant charity. Rourke smirked in waver. 20. The finality in his tone suggested the matter was settled. The crowd murmured. Briggs raised his gavel. $20 once, $20 twice. Alara stepped forward. The movement felt like wading through molasses. Dust puffed around her worn boots. Every eye swung to her, wide with disbelief. She felt the heat prickle her neck, saw Rourke's smirk vanish, replaced by a look of pure incredulity. 25. Her voice, unused to such volume, cracked slightly on the last syllable, but it rang clear in the sudden silence. A collective gasp. Whispers rustled like dry leaves. Pregnant widow Vance? Has she lost her senses? What'd she want with a broken man and 2 brats? Rourke's face darkened. He took a step towards the platform, his hand dropping to the butt of his revolver. You bidding against me, Mrs. Vance? His voice was dangerously soft. What use you got for this lot? Need someone to dig your husband's replacement. A cruel laugh followed from one of his men nearby. Alara met his gaze. The fear was there, cold and sharp in her belly, but it was buried beneath a layer of ice-cold fury and something else, a desperate, defiant hope. She thought of the small tin box buried beneath the loose floorboard by her hearth, the last of Silas's savings meant for the baby. I'm bidding, Mr. Rourke, she stated, her voice gaining strength. My money's as good as yours. Better, maybe, seeing as it wasn't squeezed from his fortune. She held his glare, refusing to flinch. $25. Rourke's eyes narrowed to slits. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. 30. The word was a growl. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. $30. It was perilously close to her limit. She thought of the long winter, the baby coming, the isolation of her small ranch miles outside town. Could she do this? Then she looked again at the children. Lily peeked out from behind her father's leg, her huge, frightened eyes meeting Alara's for a fleeting second. Ben stared straight ahead, his small shoulders rigid, trying so hard to be a man. Caleb Holt slowly lifted his head. His gray eyes locked onto Alara's. There was no pleading, only a deep, resigned sorrow and a flicker of something like surprise. And beneath it, a question. 35, Alara said, the words leaving her lips before she could fully register the cost. It was everything she had, her shield against the future, spent in this dusty square. Rourke swore viciously under his breath. He glared at Alara, then at Marshal Briggs, who shifted uncomfortably. $35, Briggs repeated, his voice regaining its official timbre. Going once, going twice. He paused, looking pointedly at Rourke. The rancher's face was purple with rage. He spat again, turned on his heel, and stalked away, his boots kicking up plumes of dust. His parting shot, aimed at Caleb. Carry clearly. Enjoy your nurse, Holt. Won't save you from what's coming. The gavel cracked down. Sold to Mrs. Alara Vance for $35. The pronouncement landed like a physical blow. Alara swayed slightly, the reality crashing over her. What had she done? She bought a wounded stranger and his children with her last cent. Caleb Holt closed his eyes for a moment, a muscle working in his jaw. When he opened them, the resignation was still there, but the protective fire had banked, replaced by a bewildered exhaustion. The children just clung tighter. The transaction at the marshal's desk was a blur. Ilera counted out the heavy coins, eagles and half-eagles warm from her pocket, onto the scarred wood. Briggs pushed a thick, officious-looking document toward her. Indenture papers. 5 years. Sign here, Mrs. Vance. His tone held a mixture of pity and disapproval. Ilera signed Ilera Vance with a hand that trembled only slightly. Briggs then turned to Caleb. Make your mark, Holt. Caleb stared at the paper. The dense script of mockery. He took the proffered pen, his large hand shaking visibly, and made an awkward X beside his printed name. The shame radiating from him was palpable. He couldn't meet Ilera's eyes. Gathering her purchases was an exercise in awkwardness. The 2 men who'd hauled Caleb onto the platform helped him down, none too gently. He stumbled, biting back a groan as his injured arm jostled. The children followed like silent shadows. Ilera had driven her small, rickety farm wagon into town, pulled by Bess, her aging mare. The bed was half filled with sacks of flour and seed. Supplies bought before the auction had derailed her day. Can you walk? Ilera asked Caleb, her voice low. He nodded curtly, pain etching lines around his eyes. Reckon so. His voice was rough, gravelly from disuse or thirst. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, the useless arm held close. Ilera helped the children clamber into the back of the wagon. Ben scrambled up silently, his movements quick and wary. Lily needed a boost. She felt impossibly light and fragile in Ilera's hands. The little girl clutched her doll fiercely, her eyes huge as she stared up at Ilera. Sit on the sacks, it's softer, Ilera instructed gently. Lily nodded mutely, scooting back beside her brother. Ben put a thin arm around his sister's shoulders, his gaze fixed straight ahead, avoiding Ilera. Caleb managed to haul himself onto the wagon seat beside Ilera with a grunt of effort, sweat beading on his forehead beneath the bandage. He sat rigidly, staring straight ahead at Bess's flicking ears. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions, gratitude, fear, and profound awkwardness. Ilera flicked the reins. Bess plodded forward, the wagon wheels groaning in protest as they turned onto the rutted track, leading out of Dust Creek. As they cleared the last buildings, Ilera felt the weight of the town's scrutiny lift, only to be replaced by the vast, silent pressure of the open desert. Sagebrush stretched endlessly under the relentless blue sky. The only sounds were crunch of wheels, Bess's labored breathing, and the dry whisper wind through the brush. The silence was thick, suffocating. Ilera risked a glance at her passengers. Caleb's eyes were closed, his head resting back against the wagon's sideboard, his face drawn and pale beneath the grime and bruising. In the back, Lily had laid her head on Ben's shoulder, her eyes closed, though Ilera doubted she slept. Ben stared out at the passing scrubland, his expression closed and guarded like a miniature fortress. "My name is Ilera Vance," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded too loud in the emptiness. "My ranch is about an hour and a half northwest. The Silas Vance place, though just the Vance place now." She stumbled over her late husband's name. Caleb opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, the gray clouded with pain. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. His gaze took in her worn dress, the simple braid of dark hair escaping her bonnet, the undeniable swell of her pregnancy. "Caleb Holt," he rasped. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "That's Ben. And Lily." He gestured weakly toward the back with his chin. "We're obliged, Mrs. Vance." The word seemed to cost him. Shame warred with a dazed kind of gratitude. "Shouldn't have put yourself out. Rourke's reasons weren't mine," Ilera said firmly, keeping her eyes on the track. She remembered his parting threat. "Won't save you from what's coming." A cold finger traced her spine. What was coming? What debt had Caleb Holt incurred that warranted such malice? She pushed the thought down. One terrifying step at a time. You need tending. That head, your arm. "Arm's busted," Caleb muttered. Doc in Tucson said it rough before he trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands. clenched uselessly in his lap, before things went south. Head just needs cleaning, I expect. He fell silent again, the effort of speaking seeming to drain him. The miles crawled by. The sun dipped lower, painting the western sky in streaks of orange and purple. The air cooled slightly, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Ilera pointed out landmarks. A distinctive red butte, a dry wash they crossed carefully. Caleb nodded silently. Ben watched the landscape with intense focus, as if memorizing a route. Lily slept fitfully, her doll clutched tight. As the Vance homestead came into view, a modest single-story cabin of adobe and timber, a small corral, a lean-to barn, all huddled beneath a protective rise. Ilera felt a familiar pang. Silas's absence was a physical ache within these walls. But now, she wasn't returning alone. She guided Bess into the yard, the wagon creaking to a halt. "Home," she announced, her voice sounding falsely bright. She climbed down stiffly, her back protesting. Caleb moved slowly, carefully lowering himself. He stood for a moment, swaying slightly, surveying the small, neat ranch with unreadable eyes. Ben jumped down and immediately helped Lily, his small face serious. Ilera pushed open the heavy wooden door. The main room was cool and dim, smelling faintly of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the beeswax she used on the rough-hewn furniture. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sturdy table and chairs stood in the center. A rocking chair sat near the hearth. A door led to the single bedroom. A ladder led to a small loft. "Ben, Lily, you can sit by the table," Ilera said, moving towards the hearth to stir the bank coals into a small flame. She lit a kerosene lamp, pushing back the gloom. The children hesitated on the threshold, shadows in the lamplight. Lily pressed close to Ben. He put a protective arm around her again, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the empty rocking chair. Caleb stood just inside the door, filling the small space with his battered presence, looking profoundly out of place. "Ma'am," he began, his voice strained, "we don't mean to impose." "A corner of the barn." "Nonsense," Ilera interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. She pulled a chair out from the table. "Sit. You're in no state for a barn. Children, sit." She poured water from a pitcher into a basin and grabbed clean rags from a shelf. "That bandage needs changing, and I'll need to look at that arm." Caleb hesitated, then slowly sank into the chair, a sigh escaping him as his weight settled. He winced as Ilera carefully began peeling away the crusted, bloodied bandage from his temple. Ben guided Lily to sit on a bench against the wall, watching Ilera's every move with intense, dark eyes. Lily sucked her thumb, her gaze fixed on her father. The wound beneath was ugly, a deep gash starting above his left eyebrow and trailing back into his hairline, swollen and angry red at the edges. It had been crudely stitched, the thread dark with dried blood and grime. Ilera bit her lip, suppressing a gasp. She dipped a rag in the cool water. "This might sting," she murmured. Caleb nodded, bracing himself. He closed his eyes as the wet cloth touched the skin. He hissed through clenched teeth, but didn't pull away. Ilera worked as gently as she could, cleaning away the dirt and old blood. Up close, she saw the network of fine lines around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw beneath the pain. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-30s, but hardship had aged him prematurely. His hands, resting on his knees, were large and calloused, a rancher's hands, though one was swollen and discolored around the crude splint binding his forearm. "What happened?" she asked softly, more to distract him than anything. His eyes opened, meeting hers for a brief, intense moment before flickering away. "Land," he rasped. "Water rights. My partner thought we were brothers. Turns out Rourke offered him more." Bitterness coated the words like tar. "Waited till I was checking the north fence line. Ambushed me. Took the deed. Left me for dead in a wash. Ben found me. Dragged me back to house." He glanced towards his son, a fleeting look of anguished pride mixed with guilt. "Rourke showed up next day with the law, Marshal Briggs, who owes him plenty. Claimed the debt, called it forfeit. Said the land was his now. Took everything. Put us on the block. He fell silent, the shame returning, thick and choking. Ilara's hand still for a moment. The brutality of it, the betrayal. It echoed her own loss, though Silas's death was an accident, not malice. She finished cleaning the head wound. Stitches need redoing, she said quietly. Properly. I'll do it tomorrow. For now, we'll just keep it clean. She reached for a jar of salve, comfrey and yarrow mixed in lard. Silas swore by it. The pungent, herbal smell filled the small space. Caleb flinched slightly as she applied it, but then relaxed marginally as the cooling effect took hold. Thank you, ma'am, he murmured, the words thick. Ilara, she corrected gently. She moved to his arm, carefully unwrapping the dirty cloth, holding the splint. The break was obvious, the forearm swollen and purpling. The splint was just two rough sticks tied on haphazardly. Oh, Caleb, she breathed. This needs setting properly, too. That Tucson doctor wasn't a real doc, Caleb said grimly. Just a drunk who claimed he did more harm than good. Ilara nodded, her mind racing. She had some knowledge, learned from her mother, and honed helping Silas with ranch injuries. But a bad break. We'll manage, she said, with more confidence than she felt. She rewrapped the arm with clean cloth, making the splint slightly more secure. Rest is what you need most. Both of you. She looked towards the children. Ben still watched her, his expression unreadable. Lily's eyes were heavy. Hunger gnawed at Ilara too. Right, she said, standing up, brushing her hands on her apron. Supper. It won't be much. She moved towards a small pantry area. Ben, Lily, are you hungry? Lily nodded hesitantly. Ben just stared. Ilara took out the last loaf of bread she'd baked, some hard cheese, and a jar of preserved peaches. A rare treat. She sliced the bread thickly, laid out the cheese, and spooned peaches into 3 small bowls. She placed 2 bowls and a slice of bread and cheese in front of the children on the bench. Lily looked at the peaches, then up at Ilara, a flicker of something like wonder in her eyes. Ben stared at the food, then at his father, as if seeking permission. It's all right, Ben, Caleb said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Eat. Slowly, cautiously, Ben picked up a slice of bread. Lily needed no further encouragement. She picked up a peach slice with her fingers and ate it, juice running down her chin. A tiny, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her. Ben took a small bite of bread, his eyes never leaving Ilara as she brought a plate to Caleb and sat down opposite him with her own meager portion. They ate in silence, the only sound to crackle of the small fire and the scrape of spoons. Ilara watched the children eat, a fragile warmth spreading through her chest, momentarily pushing back the chill of Rourke's threat and the enormity of what she'd undertaken. Caleb ate methodically, his gaze distant, lost in his own pain and troubles. The lamplight cast long, wavering shadows on the adobe walls. After clearing the sparse meal, exhaustion hit Ilara like a wave. She showed Caleb the small loft, accessible by the ladder, where Silas had sometimes slept during lambing season. It held a narrow cot and some blankets. You take the loft, she said. Children can sleep on pallets by the hearth. I'll make them up. Ma'am, Ilara, Caleb protested weakly. I can't take your bed. You can barely climb the ladder as it is, Ilara stated. And you need to be off that arm. It's settled. Her tone left no room for argument. She busied herself pulling spare blankets and a worn quilt from a chest, making 2 small beds near the fireplace's warmth. Ben watched her, then silently helped smooth the blankets. Lily, clutching her doll, stood close to her brother. Ilara banked a fire for the night. The cabin settled into a deep quiet, broken only by the wind finding cracks in the doorframe. Caleb, moving with agonizing slowness, managed the ladder to the loft. Ben guided Lily to her pallet. The little girl lay down, curling around her doll. Ben sat beside his own pallet, watching as Ilara prepared to retreat to her bedroom. "Ben," Ilara said softly, pausing by her door. "You should sleep too." He looked up at her, his face pale in the dim light. For the first time, the fierce guard seemed to slip, revealing the terrified child beneath. "Is he coming?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "The bad man? Is he coming here?" Ilara's breath caught. She thought of Rourke's parting threat, the menace in his eyes. She thought of the vast, empty land outside, offering no protection. The fragile warmth she'd felt evaporated. She forced a calm she didn't feel into her voice. "We're safe here tonight, Ben. Try to sleep." She offered him what she hoped was a reassuring smile. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly and lay down, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling beams. Ilara retreated to her room, closing the door softly, leaning against it. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the small, insistent flutter of life within. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, for lives now depended on her in this lonely outpost. The silence of the house felt different now, not just empty, but watchful, waiting. She moved to the small window, pushing aside the rough curtain. The moon was rising, casting a cold, silver light over the yard, the corral, the vast expanse of scrubland stretching towards the distant, dark bulk of the mountains. Movement caught her eye. Near the edge of the property, where the trail from town crested a small rise, a dark shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of a pinyon pine. A horse and rider. Silhouetted against the moonlit sky, the rider sat perfectly still for a long moment, facing the cabin. Then, slowly, deliberately, he touched his hat brim in a mocking salute before turning his horse and melting back into the night. Ilara's blood ran cold. The bread and cheese she'd eaten turned to lead in her stomach. Rourke, or one of his men, watching, marking the place, won't save you from what's coming. The silent rider wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. They hadn't escaped Dust Creek after all. The desert, vast and indifferent, had just become a cage. She clutched the windowsill, her knuckles white, staring into the moon-washed darkness where the rider had vanished. The fragile piece of the cabin shattered before it had even begun. The rider's silhouette against the moon, that mocking tip of the hat, froze the blood in Ilara's veins. It was a punctuation mark on Rourke's threat, stark and undeniable in the vast, indifferent night. She stood at the window long after the shape dissolved into the pinyon shadows, her hand pressed against the cold adobe wall, the other instinctively cradling the swell of her unborn child. The fragile peace she'd felt over supper, watching Lily eat peaches, shattered completely. The cabin walls, once a refuge of Silas's memory, now felt thin as parchment against the malice outside. Won't save you from what's coming. The desert wind whistling through the chinks in the doorframe sounded like a taunt. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the settling timbers, every rustle outside, a coyote, surely, or the wind in the sage, became the stealthy approach of Rourke's men. She heard Ben shifting restlessly on his pallet, heard Caleb's low, pained groan from the loft. They were all listening, prisoners of the dark and the unseen threat. The weight of her impulsive act at the auction pressed down heavier than ever. For lives, 5 counting the tiny flutter within her, hinged on her choices now. Silas's face swam in her memory, not laughing this time, but serious, his callous hand covering hers on the plow handle their first spring. "Gotta be stubborn as the land itself, Ali," he'd said, sweat streaking the dust on his brow. "It'll try to break you, but you dig in deeper." Stubbornness. She had that. But was it enough against a man like Rourke? Dawn came reluctantly, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and grays. Ilara rose stiffly, her body aching with fatigue and tension. The main room was still dim. Ben was already awake, sitting upright on his pallet, his blanket pulled tight, eyes fixed on the door. Lily slept fitfully, her corn-husked doll tucked under her chin. From the loft came the sound of Caleb trying to move, followed by a stifled curse. Ilara stirred the embers in the hearth, adding kindling. The small flare of light and warmth was a feeble defiance against the chill inside and out. "Morning," she said, her voice raspy. Ben jumped slightly, then nodded, his gaze flicking from her to the door and back. "Morning, ma'am." He didn't ask about the rider. His tense posture said he knew. Caleb's face appeared at the edge of the loft opening, pale and strained beneath the grimy bandage. "Mrs. Vance, Elara," he corrected himself. "Need to see to Bess. Water her." The effort to speak was visible. "You need to see to yourself first," Elara stated, pulling the basin and clean rags toward the table. "That head wound needs proper stitching, and that arm—" She didn't finish the sentence. The memory of the swollen, poorly set bone beneath the dirty splint tightened her stomach. "Ben, can you fetch water?" "The bucket's by the door. The well's just outside." Ben looked at his father. Caleb gave a small nod. "Go on, son. Be quick." The boy scrambled up, grabbing the wooden bucket, his movement swift and silent. He paused at the door, scanning the yard through the crack before slipping out. Elara helped Caleb down the ladder. He moved like an old man, every step jarring his injuries. Sweat beaded on his forehead by the time he sank into the chair. Elara unwrapped the bandage from his temple. In the clear morning light, the wound looked even uglier, the crude stitches ragged, the flesh around them inflamed and weeping. She boiled water, added a pinch of precious salt, and soaked clean linen strips. "This is going to hurt," she warned, threading a fine needle she'd sterilized in the boiling water. Her mother's needle, kept in a small bone case, a familiar weight in her hand. "Can't hurt much worse than knowing Rourke's got eyes on your children," Caleb muttered, his jaw clenched. He gripped the edge of the table with his good hand, knuckles white. His eyes, that clear gray, met hers. There was pain there, yes, but also a simmering anger and a profound weariness. "Appreciate this, Elara, more than you know." She began, her hand steady despite the tremor inside. The needle pierced inflamed skin, drawing the ragged edges together. Caleb hissed, his breath catching, but he held remarkably still, his gaze fixed on the opposite wall. The silence stretched, thick with his pain and her concentration, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sound the well pulley as Ben worked. "Why?" Elara asked softly, tying off a stitch. The question hung in the air. Why such hatred? Why pursue a broken man and his children? Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. "Land," he said again, the word bitter. "Good land. The triple tumble, my pa's place. Not big, but had something Rourke covets worse than gold. Silver Spring." He opened his eyes, staring past her. "Only reliable water source for miles around this time of year. My partner, Jed Carter, grew up together. Worked the ranch side by side for 10 years. Like brothers." His voice thickened. Rourke wanted that water for his cattle. Wanted to choke out the smaller spreads. Offered Jed double what the place was worth, and a cut of Rourke's profits downstream. "Jed, he waited." Caleb swallowed hard. "Waited till I was alone, checking fence on the far north boundary. Came at me from behind with a rifle, but thought he'd kill me. Took the deed from my pocket." He looked down at his broken arm. "Doc in Tucson wasn't a doc. One of Rourke's men, I reckon. Made sure this wouldn't heal right." He lifted his gaze back to Elara's, shame warring with fury. "Left me useless. Easy pickings for the auction block. Rourke gets the land, the water, and the satisfaction of seeing me broken." Elara tied off the last stitch, her mind reeling. It was worse than she'd imagined. Not just greed, but a calculated cruelty designed to humiliate and destroy. Silver Spring. That explained Rourke's relentless malice. Water was lifeblood in this desert. Controlling it was power. And Caleb Holt, even broken, was a symbol of defiance Rourke needed to erase completely. "The children?" she asked, dabbing salve gently on the newly closed wound. A spasm of anguish crossed Caleb's face. "A message," he rasped. Show everyone what happens when you cross Silas Rourke. Show me. He looked towards the door where Ben was returning, struggling with the heavy bucket. Ben saw Jed hit me, tried to stop him. Jed just laughed, shoved him down. The raw pain in his voice was for his son's shattered innocence as much as his own betrayal. Ben came in, setting the bucket down with a thud. He didn't look at his father or Alara. His small face closed off again, but he'd done the chore. Lily stirred, blinking sleepily. Alara finished bandaging Caleb's head, then turned her attention to his arm. Carefully unwrapping the splint, she assessed the damage. The break was bad, likely compounded by the rough handling and travel. It needed resetting. The prospect terrified her, but leaving it would cripple him. "It's crooked," she said quietly. "It needs to be broken again and set properly." Caleb flinched. I can try, but I need something stronger to bind it. Proper splints." Before Caleb could respond, the sound of hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, approached the cabin. Everyone froze. Ben instantly moved in front of Lily, his body tense. Caleb tried to push himself up, wincing. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door, peering through a crack. Not Rourke, an older man on a patient-looking mule, leading a second mule laden with sacks. Jeremiah Pike. He ran the general store in Dust Creek, a man known more for his gossip than his malice, but whose loyalties were often swayed by the loudest voice or deepest pocket. Alara took a steadying breath and opened the door. "Morning, Mr. Pike." "Mrs. Vance." Pike nodded, his eyes sharp and curious. Taking the scene behind her, the wounded man at the table, the children huddled. "Heard you. Acquired some help." His tone was carefully neutral. "Brought your order. Flour, beans, coffee, and that salt you wanted." He began unloading the sacks near the door. "That's kind of you," Alara said, keeping her voice level. "Saves me the trip into town." She counted out coins from her dwindling reserve, money she'd set aside for supplies before the auction. Pike pocketed the coins, his gaze lingering on Caleb. "Ho, ain't it? Heard Rourke was powerful displeased yesterday. Powerful displeased." He lowered his voice slightly. "Men been asking round town. About you, Mrs. Vance. About where you might have gone with your purchases. Asking about this place." He glanced meaningfully toward the rise where the rider had been. "Rourke don't like being crossed, nor does he like loose ends." He mounted his mule. "Just thought you ought to know. Watch yourself out here. Lonesome place." He touched his hat brim, not mockingly like the rider, but with a somber finality, and turned his mule back towards the trail. The words hung heavy in the air after he left. Loose ends. Ben and Lily. Caleb, her unborn child. Her. Alara closed the door, leaning against it. The supplies were a small relief, but Pike's news was a cold confirmation. Rourke wasn't just watching. He was actively hunting. The rest of the day unfolded under a pall of tension. Alara reset Caleb's arm. It was a brutal, agonizing process. Caleb bit down on a leather strap, his screams muffled, sweat pouring off him. Ben watched, white-faced but silent, holding Lily, who buried her face in his shirt. Alara worked with grim determination, using straight, sturdy branches she'd whittled smooth and strips torn from an old sheet, binding the arm tight. Caleb passed out briefly from the pain. When he came to, he was trembling, his face ashen, but the bone was straighter. Necessity forced cooperation. Water needed fetching constantly. For drinking, for cleaning Caleb's wounds, for beginnings of vegetable patch Alara was determined to tend. Ben, once given a clear, necessary task, became fiercely focused. He took over water duty, making trip after trip, his small frame straining, but his movements efficient. He watched the horizons constantly. Lily was quieter. She shadowed Ben, clutching her doll. But later, as Alara sat mending a tear in Ben's too small shirt, Lily crept closer. She stood watching for a long moment, then silently held out her doll. One of its cornhusk arms was hanging by a thread. "Looks like she needs mending too," Ilara said softly, patting the bench beside her. Lily hesitated, then climbed up. Ilara took the doll gently. "We'll fix her right up." She threaded a needle with a scrap of blue calico. Lily watched, rapt, her earlier fear momentarily replaced by fascination. As Ilara carefully stitched the doll's arm, Lily's small hand crept onto Ilara's knee. It was a tiny gesture, feather-light, but it sent a surge of warmth through Ilara, fierce and protective. She saw Caleb watching them from his chair, a complex mix of pain, gratitude, and sorrow in his eyes. As dusk began to paint the sky in fiery oranges and reds, Ilara walked the perimeter of the small yard, a habit born of Pike's warning and the memory of the rider. She checked the corral, where Bess stood contentedly. Near the back corner of the small barn, partially obscured by a clump of hardy desert grass, something caught her eye. It wasn't natural. Kneeling, she pushed the grass aside. Driven deep into dry earth was a wooden stake. Tied to it, fluttering faintly in the evening breeze, was a strip of dark red cloth, the color of dried blood, or Rourke's bandana. It wasn't just a marker. It felt like a claim, a promise. "We know where you are." Her breath caught. She looked up instinctively, scanning the surrounding ridges, the deepening shadows of the arroyo. Nothing moved but the wind and a circling hawk high above. Yet the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes calculating the distance, was overwhelming. The stake was close. Too close. They'd been right up to the barn. Tonight? Would they come tonight? She pulled the stake from the ground, the rough wood scraping her palm. The red cloth felt obscene in her hand. She crumpled it, stuffing it deep into her apron pocket, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The defiant hope she'd nurtured while mending Lily's doll curdled into cold dread. They weren't just loose ends. They were prey, cornered on her own land. She clutched the stake like a weapon she didn't know how to use, staring out at the vast, darkening desert, knowing the hunter was out there, closing in, the silence before the storm had just shattered. The rough wood of the stake scraped Ilara's palm, a visceral echo of the violation. The red cloth, like a scrap of dry blood, felt obscene in her apron pocket. They'd been here, touched her land, marked it, prey. The word hammered in her skull as she scanned the deepening twilight, the vast desert swallowing the last fiery streaks of sunset. Every shadow in the arroyo, every rustle of sage, pulsed with unseen menace. Rourke wasn't just watching. He was counting down. Back inside, the cabin's warmth felt fragile, illusory. Caleb was propped in a rocking chair near the hearth, sweat sheening his pale face from the ordeal of resetting his arm. Ben sat rigidly on the floor, sharpening a stick with Silas's old pocket knife under Caleb's watchful eye, a small, focused task to channel his fear. Lily clutched her mended doll, watching Ilara with wide, silent eyes. Ilara held up the stake, the red cloth dangling. The air thickened. Caleb's breath hitched, his knuckles whitening on the chair arm. Ben's whittling stopped, his gaze locking onto the cloth like a rabbit spotting a hawk. "They were at the barn," Ilara stated, her voice low and taut. "Close." Caleb's jaw worked. "Means they're done scouting." His voice was gravel-scraped raw. "Means they're ready." The finality of it sent a shiver through Ilara. She dropped the stake into the fire. The dry wood caught quickly, the red cloth curling and blackening, releasing a faint, acrid smell, a small defiance. "Then we get ready to—" The word surprised her with their steadiness. She turned to Ben. "Ben, I need your eyes. Best eyes on the place. You see anything dust cloud, movement, a rider, you shout. Loud. Understand?" Ben nodded, a fierce light replacing some of the fear in his eyes. Responsibility. A shield. "Yes, ma'am." He scrambled up, moving to the window, peering out with renewed intensity. "Caleb," Ilara continued, turning to him, "tell me what Rourke really wants. Silver Spring is water, yes, but water rights don't explain this hate. Why the children? Why this marking? Caleb looked away, staring into the flames consuming the steak. Shame warred with exhaustion. It ain't just the water, Alara, he admitted. The words drag out of him. Though that's gold in this desert. Silver Spring, its name true. He paused, gathering strength. My grandpappy found traces. Silver traces. Never enough to mine proper, he reckoned. Not back then. But he knew. Told my papa told me. We kept it quiet. Just a little hope, a secret for hard times. He met Alara's gaze, his gray eyes haunted. Rourke. He found out. Somehow. Jed must have known, must have told him to sweeten the pot. Rourke doesn't just want the water. He wants what's under it. He thinks there's a vein. And he thinks. Caleb swallowed hard, looking at his children. He thinks Ben knows where the old test diggings are. Pa showed Ben last summer, told him the family secret. Jed knew that too. Rourke figures the boy can lead him right to it. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Not just land, not just water. Silver. Greed sharpened to a razor's edge. And Ben, a child, seen as a key, a tool to be used and discarded. Alara's hand instinctively went to her belly. Rourke saw people as obstacles or assets. Nothing more. The stakes weren't just survival. They were souls. They won't take him, Alara said, her voice low and fierce. They won't touch either of them. Caleb's eyes held a depth of gratitude mixed with profound sorrow. I brought this on you, on your child. You didn't bring Jed's greed or Rourke's evil, Alara countered sharply. We're here now. Together, we fought up. She remembered Silas, years ago, reinforcing the door after rumors of bandits. Gotta make your home a fortress, Ellie, he grunted, hammering iron brackets into the thick wood. Walls ain't just wood and adobe. Their will, his stubborn will live in her hands now. Action was the antidote to terror. Alara moved through the cabin with grim purpose. She dragged a heavy table, scraping loudly on the packed earth floor, barricading the lower half of the door. She found the thick wooden shutters Silas had crafted for the two small windows, rarely used, stored in the lean-to. They were warped by seasons, heavy with dust. Ben helped her wrestle them inside, his small frame straining. Caleb, despite his injuries, insisted on directing, using his good hand to point where the iron brackets needed securing inside the window frames. Lily watched, clutching her doll. As Alara paused, wiping sweat from her brow with a dusty forearm, Lily approached silently. She held up the doll. Her name's Blue, she whispered, touching the tiny scrap of blue calico Alara had used to mend. Blue's a strong name, Alara said softly, offering a tired smile. Suits her. Lily's small, tentative smile in return was a fragile bloom in the darkness. She didn't retreat, just stood near Alara's leg, offering silent companionship as the adults worked. It took hours. The cabin grew dim, lit only by the fire and a single lamp. The air filled with the scent of dust, sweat, and coal oil Alara used to loosen rusty hinges. The shutters, once secure with heavy iron hooks Silas had forged, transformed the windows into narrow, defensible slits. The barricaded door felt substantial, a physical manifestation of their defiance. Exhaustion pulled at Alara, a deep ache settling in her back and limbs, but the act of doing and preparing forged a brittle kind of strength. Dawn was a gray smudge on the horizon when the sound came, not hoofbeats, but the crunch of a single boot on gravel, close to the cabin. Then a low whistle, sharp and unnatural, a signal. Ben, stationed at the east window slit, went rigid. Someone's out there, by the corral. Alara's heart leapt into her throat. She grabbed the old, heavy adze Silas used for shaping wood, a clumsy weapon but better than nothing. Caleb struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the table, his face tight with pain and fury. He held Silas's drawn knife, its curved blade gleaming dully. Lily shrank back towards the hearth, pulling Ben with her. A voice called out, rough and taunting. "Holt, you in there?" Boss sent a message. Open up. Save us the trouble of breaking in. It wasn't Rourke. A hired thug, likely one of the leering men from the auction. Ilera moved to the door, peering through a gap above the table barricade. A man stood 20 paces away, near the corral fence, lean, unshaven, wearing a dusty duster and a hat pulled low. He held a rifle loosely, but his posture was cocky, confident. He hadn't seen the shutters yet in the dim light. Behind him, 2 horses stood ground-tethered near the arroyo mouth. "Get off my land," Ilera shouted, her voice clear and hard, cutting through the morning stillness. She projected a confidence she didn't feel. "You got no business here." The man started, peering toward the cabin. He squinted, finally noticing the shuttered windows. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, looky here. Fortin up, are we? Cute." He spat. "Rourke says time's up. Holt. He wants what's his. The deed's settled, but he'll be generous. Hand over the boy, quiet-like, and maybe he lets the rest of you crawl away. Woman, and her brat included." His gaze swept dismissively over the cabin. "This dust heap ain't worth the bullets. Hand over the boy." The words were iced down Ilera's spine. Ben made a small, choked sound behind her. Caleb growled, a feral sound of rage, pushing forward despite his injuries. "You touch him, I'll kill you." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You ain't killing nothing with that busted wing, Holt. Now be sensible. Send the kid out." Ilera's mind raced. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but beneath its surge of fear's protective fury, this man thought they were cornered, helpless. He didn't know her. She remembered Silas facing down a rattler in the root cellar, calm and deliberate. "Don't show the fear, Ellie. Make em think you're the bigger snake. Listen close." Ilera called, her voice dropping lower, colder. "You tell Silas Rourke something for me." She paused, letting the silence stretch, making the man lean forward slightly. "Tell him Ilera Vance bought Caleb Holt and his children. They're mine. This land is mine. And if he or any of his hired curs sets foot here again..." She hefted the adze, letting its heavy head catch the faint dawn light through the slit. "They'll leave in pieces, starting with you." The raw venom in her voice surprised even her. The man's grin faltered. He shifted his weight, his cockiness replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected this defiance, especially not from a pregnant woman. He glanced back towards his horses, then at the shuttered cabin, reassessing. Big words for a woman alone with a cripple and brats. "I ain't alone," Ilera stated flatly. "And I ain't afraid to die defending what's mine. Are you afraid to die for Rourke Silver?" She saw the flinch at the word silver. Confirmation Caleb's secret was indeed out. The man's face darkened. He raised his rifle slightly. "You're making a mistake, woman." "First shot you fire," Caleb roared from behind Ilera, finding his voice, thick with pain but resonant, "brings every rancher within 5 miles riding hard. You think Rourke wants that attention? You think he wants folks knowing why he's really hounded a broke man and his kids? Silver's a powerful lure, for more than just you." The scout hesitated, clearly wrestling with his orders and this unexpected resistance. The element of surprise was gone. The cabin was fortified. Killing them wouldn't be clean or quiet. And Rourke's precious secret was laid bare. He spat again, a long stream of brown tobacco juice hitting the dust. "This ain't over, Vance. You sealed your fate." He backed up slowly, keeping his rifle half raised, then turned and mounted his horse in one swift motion. He kicked it into a lope, his partner following, kicking up a plume of dust as they disappeared down the trail towards Dust Creek. Ilera sagged against the barricaded door, the adze clattering from her suddenly nerveless hand. Her legs trembled. The confrontation had lasted minutes, but felt like hours. Caleb sank back into the rocker, breathing hard, his face ashen. Ben rushed to the window, watching until the dust settled. Lily crept out from behind the hearth, her doll clutched tight, looking to Alara for reassurance. "We bought time," Caleb rasped. "Not much." Alara nodded, pushing away from the door. The scout's parting words echoed. "You sealed your fate," and his flinch at the mention of silver. Rourke's motive was naked now, but it only made him more dangerous. He couldn't afford to let them live, not with the secret out. He'd come back, soon, with more men. She needed to check the perimeter, see if the scout had left anything else. Motioning Ben to keep watch, she unbarred the door just enough to slip out into the cool dawn air. The silence felt charged now, brittle. She walked towards the corral, scanning the ground near where the scout had stood. Nothing. Then, her gaze swept towards the arroyo mouth where his horses had been ground-tethered. Something glinted in the low sunlight, half buried in the loose sand near a cluster of rocks. Not a deliberate marker, like the stake. Dropped? Alara approached cautiously. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper weighted down by a stone. Her breath caught. Had the scout left a message? A threat? She picked it up, smoothing it out. It wasn't a note. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but clear. It showed the Dust Creek area, the main trail, and a specific spot marked with a bold X northwest of town, near where Caleb's Triple Tumble Ranch lay, near Silver Spring. But it wasn't a spring marked. The X was further up canyon wall, annotations in tight, unfamiliar handwriting scrawled alongside. Primary shaft entrance? Hope family claim marker visible. Awaiting confirmation and manpower. Eliminate loose ends before extraction. The bottom edge was torn, but the final words were chillingly clear. Silence the woman. Children potentially useful, otherwise dispose. It wasn't just a map. It was an operational note. Rourke wasn't just coming to seize Ben or kill them. He was confirming the mine location and planning the extraction, the silver, and they were the loose ends to be silenced. Before extraction, the timeline had just collapsed. A cold dread, deeper than any before, washed over Alara. She looked up, her eyes instinctively scanning the ridge line to the east, the direction the scout had ridden. Movement, not a rider retreating. 3 distinct shapes, silhouetted against the rising sun, cresting the ridge. Horses, riders, moving slowly, deliberately, spreading out. Not scouts, an advance party, scanning the terrain, planning their approach. Rourke wasn't waiting. He was moving. Now, the confirmation of the mine's location had accelerated everything. The brittle time they bought with their defiance was measured in minutes, maybe hours. The vast desert offered no escape. The fortified cabin felt suddenly like a trap waiting to be sprung. Alara crumpled the damning map in her fist, her heart pounding a frantic drumbeat against her ribs as she watched the dark figures fan out along the ridge, blocking the eastern horizon. How long? The question screamed silently in the stillness of the new day. How long until the storm broke? The 3 riders, stark black cutouts against the molten gold of the rising sun, fanned out along the eastern ridge like vultures choosing their angle. Time, the brittle commodity Alara thought they'd bought, shattered into dust motes dancing in the harsh morning light. Before extraction, the words from the crumpled map screamed in her mind. Rourke wasn't just coming for them. He was coming for the silver, and they were inconvenient litter to be swept aside first. She scrambled back inside, slamming the heavy door and throwing the bar back into place with a thud that echoed through the suddenly claustrophobic cabin. Caleb was already struggling to rise from the rocker, his face etched with pain and grim understanding. Ben stood frozen at the window slit, his small frame rigid. Lily whimpered, burying her face in Ben's shirt. Riders, Alara gasped, pressing her back against the door as if her weight alone could hold back the tide. 3, on the east ridge, scouting maybe more behind. She thrust the crumpled map towards Caleb. He found the shaft. He's moving now. We're loose ends. Caleb's knuckles whitened as he scanned the crude drawing, the damning annotations. A low groan escaped him, part pain, part fury. God Almighty! He looked at his children, Ben's terrified eyes meeting his, Lily's muffled sobs. The weight of his failure, the danger he brought crashing down on them all, settled on him like a physical burden. Then his gaze shifted to Alara, standing resolute against the door, her hand instinctively cradling her unborn child. His eyes, that stormy gray, held a desperate calculation. "Alara," he rasped, the words thick with urgency and something else. Shame, perhaps, or plea. There's nothing legal bin us. Not really. Just that indenture Paper Briggs wrote. Rourke, he'll use that. Say I'm his property. Say the kids are part of the debt. He'll twist it, claim you stole his assets. He swallowed hard, forcing the next words out. But if we were married, man and wife, a family under the law, it muddies his claim, makes you Ben and Lily's stepmother, right and proper, makes this place our place, gives us a stronger stand, maybe buys us time, throws a wrench in his legal thieving debt. He couldn't meet her eyes fully. I know it ain't what you dreamed, not romantic, just a shield, for them. He nodded towards the children. For your baby. The proposal hung in the dusty air, as pragmatic and brutal as the stakes they faced. Marriage, not born of love, but of sheer, desperate necessity. A legal fortress against the predator. Alara stared at him, the world narrowing to the pounding of her own heart, the terrified whimpers of Lily, the watchful intensity in Ben's eyes. She thought of Silas, his warm laugh, the calloused hand that had slipped a simple silver band onto her finger beneath the cottonwood tree by the creek. "Forever, Ellie," he'd whispered, his eyes bright with a future they planned. This was the antithesis of that sun-dappled moment. It was a transaction in the shadow of death. Yet Silas's voice echoed, not in laughter, but in the quiet, stubborn resolve he'd shown building their life here. Family ain't always blood, Ellie. It's who you stand with when the wind howls. She looked at Caleb, broken but fighting. At Ben, trying so hard to be brave. At Lily, small and utterly dependent. At the swell beneath her hand. Silas's legacy. They were her stand now. A shield, Caleb called it. But shields protect. And she needed every layer of protection she could forge. "Yes," she said, the word clear and decisive, cutting through the fear. "Yes, Caleb Holt. We'll marry. Today. Now." There was no room for hesitation. The riders on the ridge were a ticking clock. Relief wore with profound guilt in Caleb's eyes. "Thank you," he breathed, the words heavy. "I swear, I'll—" Later, Alara interrupted, already moving. "Ben, keep watch. Tell me if they move closer. Lily, sweetheart, come here." She knelt, opening her arms. Lily, after a hesitant glance at Ben, stumbled into her embrace, burying her face in Alara's neck. The small, warm weight, the trust implicit in the gesture, solidified Alara's resolve. This was worth fighting for, worth marrying for. "We need a witness," she murmured to Caleb over Lily's head. Anyone. As if summoned by the desperate thought, the sound of a single horse approaching at a cautious trot came from the west, not the direction of the ridge. Ben, peering through the slit, reported, "It's Pastor Higgins, ma'am, from Dust Creek." Pastor Elias Higgins was a lean man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression, known for his quiet faith and tendency to avoid conflict. He'd buried Silas. He dismounted, his eyes widening at the shuttered windows. The barricaded door Alara cautiously opened just enough. "Mrs. Vance? Heard troubling things in town," he began, his gaze darting past her to Caleb and the children. "Rourke's men, they're gathering, talking loud, about coming out here, about settling accounts." He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. I came to pray with you, offer what comfort I can." His eyes fell on Caleb's bandaged head and splinted arm. "Mercy, Pastor Higgins," Alara said, pulling the door wider. Your timing is God's own grace. We need more than prayer. We need you to marry us. Right now." Higgins blinked, stunned. "Mary? But Mr. Vance is gone," Elara stated, her voice firm. "This is Caleb Holt, and we need to be husband and wife. Today, for the children's sake, for legal protection against Silas Rourke." Understanding, mix of profound dismay, dawned on the pastor's face. He looked from Alara's determined expression to Caleb's battered resolve, to the frightened children. He knew the weight of Rourke's shadow over Dust Creek. "Oh, my dear child," he murmured more to himself. Then, squaring his thin shoulders, he nodded. "Very well. If this is your wish and your need, I will perform the sacrament. But quickly, the touts uneasy. Rourke's paying good coin for any man willing to ride with him. Whiskey's flowing freely at the saloon. He's declared a bounty." Higgins's voice dropped, laced with fear. $50. For Caleb Holt, brought and alive. 25 for proof he's no longer a problem. His gaze flickered to Elara. "And he's offering compensation for any complications removed." He couldn't bring himself to look at her swollen belly. The bounty was a chilling escalation. It turned every desperate soul in Dust Creek into a potential enemy. It painted targets on all of them. Caleb's face hardened into granite. Ben sucked in a sharp breath. Lily trembled in Alara's arms. "Then we have no time, Pastor," Elara said, her voice icy calm despite the terror claw at her insides. She gently set Lily down, keeping a hand on her shoulder. "Please, marry us." There were no flowers, no music, no fine clothes. They stood in the dim, fortified cabin, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light piercing the window slits. Elara in her worn calico, Caleb leaning heavily on the table, his shirt stained and torn. Ben stood stiffly beside his father, Lily clinging to Alara's skirt, her doll forgotten on the floor. Pastor Higgins, his worn Bible trembling slightly in his hands, spoke the simple, timeless words over the crackle of the bank fire and the ominous silence from outside. "Do you, Caleb Holt, take this woman, Elara Vance, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Caleb looked at Elara, really looked at her. Not just the savior, the protector, but the woman, strong, afraid, defiant, carrying life amidst the threat of death. A flicker of something deeper than gratitude sparked in his weary eyes. "I do," he vowed, his voice rough but clear. "And do you, Elara Vance, take this man, Caleb Holt, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elara thought of Silas's laughing eyes. She thought of the tiny life within her. She looked at Caleb's battered face, Ben's stoic fear, Lily's wide-eyed trust. She thought of the riders on the ridge, the bounty, the word dispose. This wasn't the love Silas had promised, but it was a different kind of vow, a vow of fierce, unwavering guardianship. "I do," she declared, her voice ringing in the small space. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence and fragile hope. There was no kiss. Caleb reached out his good hand, clumsy and tentative. Elara took it. His grip was surprisingly strong, warm, a tangible connection forged in the crucible of shared peril. Ben watched the joined hands, a flicker of confused relief crossing his face. Lily pressed closer to Alara's side. Pastor Higgins closed his Bible. "May God have mercy on you all," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I must go. My presence here, it could draw more attention. I'll try to speak sense in town," but he trailed off, the futility clear. He blessed them quickly and turned to leave. As Higgins opened the door just enough to slip out, a new sound sliced through the tense quiet. A high, shrill whistle, echoing from the direction of the East Ridge. Then another from further south. Signals. Ben, back at the slit, gasped. Smoke. Ma, Pa, smoke signals. Over by the big mesa. Ilera rushed to look. Thin, deliberate columns of gray smoke were rising against the pale blue sky. One, then two, spaced in a specific pattern. Rourke wasn't just scouting, he was coordinating, positioning his men, cutting off avenues of escape. The vast desert was being methodically sectioned, the ranch the focal point. They barricaded the door again, the simple gold band Ilera now wore on her right hand. Silas's ring remained on her left, feeling cold and unfamiliar. The marriage was a shield, yes, but would it hold against bullets and greed? Caleb, drawing on reserves of pain-fueled adrenaline, started directing Ben and placing the few precious jars of preserved fruit, the heavy iron skillet, anything that could be thrown or used as a blunt instrument near the windows and door. Ilera, her mind racing, remembered Silas cursing a gopher hole that nearly broke Bess's leg. She grabbed a shovel. Ben, quick! Outside! Dig shallow holes, big as your hand. Near the front step, the path to the well. Hide them with loose dirt and grass. Hurry! Trip hazards. Small, desperate defenses. Ben didn't question. He grabbed the shovel and darted out, moving with frantic speed under Caleb's watchful eye from the window. Lily helped Ilera drag sacks of flour and seed to reinforce the bottom of the door barricade. The sense of impending doom thickened with the afternoon heat. The smoke signals ceased, leaving an even more oppressive silence. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, as Ben was patting down the dirt over the last hidden hole near the well, a sharp crack split the air. Not a gunshot. The sound of splintering wood. Ben froze. Ilera's blood ran cold. They all heard it. It came from the lean-to barn. Caleb limped to the west window slit, peering out, his face turned ashen. The water trough, he rasped, horror dawning in his voice. They've split the staves. All the water, it's draining into the dirt. Sabotage. Rourke wasn't waiting for a frontal assault. He was tightening the noose, cutting off their most vital resource under the relentless desert sun. Thirst would weaken them faster than any bullet. Panic threatened to choke Ilera. She looked at their meager water bucket, half full, looked at Caleb's fevered brow, at the children's parched lips, at her own swelling body's demands. Before she could formulate a thought, a new sound erupted. The sudden, terrified squealing of Bess from the corral. Then, the unmistakable, heavy thud of a body hitting the hard-packed earth, followed by a man's coarse laugh and the chilling sound of a rifle being levered. Ben was still outside, near the well, exposed. Ilera lunged for the door. The terrified squeal of Bess, the sickening thud, the coarse laugh, and the lethal snick-click of a rifle lever being worked. The sounds crashed over Ilera like a physical wave. Ben was out there, exposed near the well, shovel still in his hand, frozen like a jackrabbit in lantern light. Time fractured, thought vanished, replaced by a primal surge of protective fury that burned hotter than the desert sun. Ben, down! Ilera's scream ripped from her throat as she wrenched the heavy door barricade aside, ignoring Caleb's choked shout of warning. She burst out onto the porch, the blinding afternoon sun hitting her like a fist. The scene seared itself into her vision. Bess lay thrashing in the corral, a deep gash bleeding on her flank. Near the shattered water trough, a hulking figure, one of Rourke's men from the auction, stood over Ben, rifle casually leveled at the boy's head, a cruel grin splitting his beard. Ben stared up, eyes wide with terror, the shovel held uselessly before him like a twig. "Got ourselves a little gopher, boss," the man bellowed toward the arroyo. "Digging holes like a good little." Ilera didn't think. She acted. Silas's voice roared in her memory, not gentle now, but the fierce bark he'd used breaking a wild stallion. "Move fast, Ellie. Aim true." Her hand, seemingly of its own volition, snatched a heavy iron skillet she'd placed by the door. With a strength born of desperation, she hurled it. It spun, a clumsy, whistling discus, not aimed at the man's head, but at the ground just behind his boot heels. Clang, thud, The skillet hit the dirt hard, right where Ben had dug with the shallow trip holes, and artfully concealed it with loose grass and dust. The man's boot heel landed squarely on the edge of the hidden depression just as the skillet's impact startled him. His leg buckled awkwardly. He cursed, staggering off balance, the rifle muzzle dipping wildly. It was the split-second Ben needed. Instinct, honed by terror and his father's silent lessons, kicked in. He didn't run towards the cabin. He lunged forward under the man's flailing arm and drove the pointed end of the shovel hard into the man's already buckling knee. A howl of agony tore through the air, raw and inhuman. The rifle clattered to the ground. Ben scrambled back, eyes wild but moving. Ben, run. Ilera screamed again, already moving towards him, grabbing for the fallen rifle. But movement erupted from the arroyo. Two more men spurred their horses forward, guns drawn. Rourke himself appeared on the ridge above the barn, a dark silhouette, surveying the chaos with cold satisfaction. His plan was unfolding. Isolate, terrorize, pick them off. Inside the cabin, Caleb Holt was a man transformed. Pain was a distant throb, drowned by the roaring need to protect his son, his daughter, his wife. Ilera's courage, Ben's desperate lunge. It ignited a fire he thought Rourke had extinguished. He saw the rifle Ilera was reaching for, saw the two riders charging. He couldn't get to the door fast enough. His gaze swept the room, landing on the small pot-bellied stove Silas had built, its chimney pipe running up through the roof. An idea, born of desperation, and a rancher's understanding of wind and dry tinder, sparked. "Lily," Caleb rasped, his voice commanding despite its weakness. "The flour sack. By the door. Tip it. Now." Into the air. Lily, wide-eyed and trembling near the reinforced door, didn't hesitate. Pure, terrified trust in her father's voice propelled her. She grabbed the half-sack of flour Ilera had used to bolster the barricade and, with all her tiny might, heaved its contents out the narrow door opening Ilera had left, creating a billowing white cloud just as the two riders thundered into the yard. Outside, chaos multiplied. The cloud of flour enveloped the charging riders and their horses. Horses snorted, blinded and panicked by the sudden, choking dust. One rider cursed, firing wildly into the white haze. The bullet whined harmlessly over the roof. The other horse reared, unseating its rider who hit the dirt with a grunt. Ilera seized the moment. She scooped up the fallen rifle near the howling, knee-crippled man, fumbling with the unfamiliar weight and lever. She didn't need to shoot. She leveled it towards the disoriented riders emerging from the flour cloud. "Stop." Her voice, raw and powerful, cut through the din. "Next shot finds flesh." The riders hesitated, blinking flour from their eyes, momentarily cowed by the sight of the pregnant widow holding a rifle with deadly intent. Behind them, Rourke's furious bellow echoed from the ridge. "Don't just stand there. Take them." But the hesitation was enough. Ben scrambled behind Ilera, breathing hard. Caleb appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily, Silas's drawn knife held awkwardly but determinately in his good hand. His eyes locked onto Rourke on the ridge. "It's over, Silas," Caleb shouted, his voice carrying surprising strength. "The silver is a fool's dream. My grandpappy scraped traces. Nothing more. You murdered, you stole, for dust." Rourke's face contorted with rage. "Liar. The boy knows. He'll talk." He raised his own rifle, aiming not at Caleb, but at Ilera, or I'll start with a woman and her bastard. A guttural roar ripped from Caleb. "You touch her." But before he could move, before Rourke could fire, the desert itself intervened. The wind, which had been a nervous whisper, suddenly howled. A monstrous wall of reddish-brown, churning like a living thing, surged over the western horizon. The dust stormed past where Higgins had feared, arriving with apocalyptic speed. It swallowed the sun, plunging the ranch into an eerie, choking twilight within seconds. Visibility vanished. The world dissolved into a roaring, stinging maelstrom. Inside, "Now!" Ilara screamed, shoving Ben toward the door. Caleb stumbled back, pulling Lily in. Ilara backed in last, slamming the door and throwing the barricade back as the storm hit the cabin with the force of a tidal wave. Adobe walls groaned. Dust streamed through every crack and slit, filling the air inside with grit. The sounds outside, Rourke's shouts, the cursing of his men, the terrified screams of horses, were swallowed by the elemental fury. Huddled together in the suffocating, dust-filled gloom near the hearth, Caleb, Ilara, Ben, and Lily pressed close. They waited. The storm raged for what felt like hours, a deafening, abrasive assault. Ilara coughed, covering Lily's face with her shawl. Caleb held Ben close, his good arm around his son's shoulders. Ilara's hand found Caleb's, their fingers intertwining, gripping tight. Not just partners in a desperate marriage, but allies in the heart of the maelstrom. Silas's ring felt warm against her skin, the new, plain band cool beside it. She thought of him, not with piercing grief now, but with a fierce gratitude for the stubborn strength he'd taught her. Digging deeper, they had. Slowly, gradually, the roaring lessened. The wind's howl subsided to a moan, then a sigh. The dust settled inside, coating everything in a fine red powder. Weak, dust-filtered light seeped back through the shutters. Cautiously, Caleb moved to the east window slit, peering out. Ilara joined him, rifle still in hand. Though her arms trembled with exhaustion, the yard was transformed. Drifts of dust piled against the barn and corral. The shattered water trough was half buried. Bess stood trembling but alive in corral. And of Rourke and his men? Nothing. No bodies, no horses, no sign. The desert had swept them away like so much tumbleweed. Gone. Caleb breathed, disbelief warring with dawning relief. The storm, it must have scattered them, or buried them. He looked at Ilara, his eyes bloodshot and dust-caked, holding a depth of emotion words couldn't capture. You saved Ben. You saved us all. Ilara lowered the rifle, her legs suddenly weak. She leaned against the doorframe. We saved each other. She looked at Ben, who was checking on Lily, his face pale but composed, the ghost of a man who would become visible in his stance. Lily coughed, then offered Ilara a tiny, dust-covered smile, holding up Blue the doll. The threat wasn't necessarily gone forever. Ilara knew. Rourke might regroup. The bounty might still hang over them. The water was gone, the ranch battered. But in that moment, standing in the wreckage, covered in the desert's red dust, they were alive. They were together. They were a family forged in fire and wind. Caleb turned fully to her, wincing as he moved his splintered arm, but his gaze steady. That promise I made my pa, he said, his voice rough but clear, about protecting the land, the spring. It wasn't just about silver. It was about leaving something good for the next generation. He looked at Ben and Lily, then at the swell of Ilara's belly beneath the dusty calico. Seems I got a bigger promise to keep now, a family to build it for. He placed his good hand gently over hers where it rested on her belly, covering both wedding bands, the old and the new. If you'll have me, truly have me. Ilara looked around the dusty cabin, at the children, at the man who would become her husband in the eye of the storm. She thought of Silas's laughter, a cherished echo, not a chain. She thought of the stubborn land outside, waiting to be healed, like them. A future, hard-won and uncertain, but theirs. She turned her hand under Caleb's, lacing her fingers with his, feeling the twin bands press into her skin. Symbols of love lost and love fiercely chosen. We build it, she said, her voice quiet but resonant with defiant hope that bloomed amidst the dust and the lingering scent of fear. Together, outside, the desert lay quiet under the returning sun, vast and scarred, but holding the promise of rain. Someday, they would be ready. They would dig in deeper.